Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Imagine you're chilling at home when a black SUV with tinted windows rolls into your driveway, no plates, and two guys in tactical vests step out labeled HOA, Compliance and Enforcement. They start demanding your ID and threaten to arrest you over a bird feeder. So I let them think they'd won until I opened the door. I work as a process server, which means I spend my days delivering legal documents and dealing with people who really don't want to see me. After 12 years in this job, I've learned to read situations pretty quickly. I can spot fake authority from a mile away, and I know exactly what real law enforcement looks like versus someone just playing dress up. My neighborhood is one of those places where everyone keeps their lawns trimmed and their houses painted in approved colors. The HOA here takes their job seriously, maybe a little too seriously. For the past few months, they've been on this kick about what they call aesthetic harmony. Basically, they want everything to look like it came out of a catalog. The whole mess started with my bird feeder. It's nothing fancy, just a simple wooden post with a little house on top that I built myself. My late father and I used to watch birds together when I was a kid, and having that feeder in my front yard makes me feel connected to those memories. The thing is, the HOA decided that my bird feeder doesn't match their approved outdoor fixture guidelines. I've been getting notices about it for weeks. Not official legal notices, just those annoying little papers they leave in mailboxes. The HOA board seems to think that if they use enough bold text and exclamation points, people will just cave in to whatever demands they make. They clearly haven't dealt with someone who processes legal documents for a living. My property is completely up to code otherwise. The grass is cut, the house is painted in one of their approved shades of beige, and I even replaced my mailbox last year with one from their precious approved vendor list. But apparently, having a bird feeder that brings me a small amount of joy in this sterile little community is somehow destroying property values. The HOA president lives 3 houses down from me. I'd met him a few times at neighborhood barbecues before he got elected to his little throne. He seemed normal enough back then, but power has a way of changing people. Lately, he's been walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking photos of anything he considers a violation. I've seen him crouch behind bushes trying to get the perfect angle on someone's garden gnome or measuring the height of fence posts with a tape measure. Last Tuesday, I was working from home when I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway. I looked out my office window and saw a black SUV with tinted windows. No license plates that I could see from that angle, which immediately caught my attention. In my line of work, you learn to notice details like that. 2 men got out of the vehicle, and my first thought was that they looked like they were trying really hard to appear official. Both were wearing tactical vests that said HOA Compliance and Enforcement in big white letters. The vests looked new, like they'd just been ordered online. Their boots were polished, their pants were creased, and they moved with the kind of exaggerated authority that screams amateur. The older guy was maybe in his 50s, with gray hair buzzed short and wraparound sunglasses even though it was overcast. His partner looked younger, probably mid-20s, and kept touching his vest like he was making sure all the straps were still in place. Both had utility belts with various pouches and what looked like radio equipment. They walked up to my front door with purpose, the older one in front and the younger one trailing behind like a nervous backup dancer. Instead of a normal knock, the older guy pounded on my door like he was trying to break it down. 3 sharp, aggressive knocks that made my dog start barking from the kitchen. I took my time getting to the door. When you serve legal papers, you learn that rushing to respond to aggressive behavior usually makes things worse. I opened the door but kept the screen door latched between us. The older guy immediately started talking without any introduction. He said they needed to verify my residency for an active investigation and demanded to see my state identification. Not asked, demanded. His tone was the kind you'd expect from someone who thinks a vest with official-looking words gives them actual authority. I asked who they were and what agency they represented. The younger guy pointed to his vest and said they were HOA enforcement officers conducting a compliance investigation. He seemed proud of the word enforcement, like he'd been practicing saying it. The older guy told me they had detainment authority under Section 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, and that refusing to cooperate with their investigation could result in immediate arrest. He said this with complete confidence, like he actually believed it was true. I've read enough legal documents to know that HOAs don't have arrest powers. They can fine homeowners, file liens, and take people to court, but they can't detain anyone. This guy was either seriously misinformed or deliberately lying. Given the theatrical nature of their whole setup, I was leaning toward the latter. I told them I needed to see their badge numbers and official identification before I could cooperate with any investigation. The older guy seemed annoyed by this request and pointed to a plastic ID card clipped to his vest. It had the HOA logo and a QR code, but no badge number or government seal. It looked like something you'd get at a corporate conference. The younger guy showed me his card too, and it was identical except for a different QR code. When I asked what agency issued these credentials, they exchanged a quick look that told me everything I needed to know. These weren't law enforcement officers. They weren't even security guards with any real authority. They were just two guys in costumes playing cop. I stayed behind my screen door and explained that I wasn't comfortable providing identification without seeing proper credentials from a recognized law enforcement agency. The older guy's demeanor changed immediately. His voice got harder and he moved closer to the door. He told me that obstruction of an HOA investigation was a serious offense and that they had the authority to place me under citizen's arrest. His hand moved to his utility belt where I could see what looked like a holster. The gesture was clearly meant to intimidate me. The younger guy stepped forward and said they just needed to verify some information about violations on my property. He had this tone like he was trying to be the good cop in their little performance. He mentioned the bird feeder specifically and said there had been complaints from multiple neighbors about its impact on community standards. I asked for the names of the neighbors who complained and the specific HOA bylaws that my bird feeder supposedly violated. The older guy said that information was part of an ongoing investigation and couldn't be disclosed to me until I provided proper identification and proof of residency. This whole conversation was happening through my screen door, and I could see they were getting frustrated with my lack of cooperation. The older guy kept checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be. The younger guy was shifting his weight from foot to foot and touching his radio equipment. I told them I understood their position and that if they were planning to arrest me, I would need the specific violations and the names of the complaining parties in writing on an official notice. I explained that this was standard procedure for any enforcement action and that I was sure they wanted to follow proper protocol. The older guy seemed to think he'd won something. He smiled and pulled out a clipboard with pre-printed forms. He said they'd be happy to provide me with proper documentation and that once I saw everything in writing, I'd understand the seriousness of the situation. While they spent the next several minutes filling out paperwork, I quietly moved to my kitchen and activated my doorbell camera to make sure everything was being recorded. I also called the sheriff's non-emergency line and explained that there were armed individuals at my home claiming to be law enforcement officers but refusing to provide proper credentials. The dispatcher asked if I felt threatened, and I explained that they had made arrest threats and that one appeared to be carrying a weapon. She said deputies would be dispatched to my location and asked me to stay on the line until they arrived. When the older guy finished with his paperwork, he handed me a document through the screen door. It was titled Field Citation for HOA Code Violations and was full of legal-sounding language that didn't actually make any sense. It listed a $500 refusal fee for failure to cooperate with an investigation and threatened additional penalties if I didn't comply within 24 hours. The document was clearly designed to intimidate people who didn't know better. It had official-looking headers and footer text, but none of the actual legal requirements for a valid citation or notice. There were no case numbers, no court information, and no contact details for appealing the alleged violations. I read through the entire document while they waited impatiently outside my door. The older guy kept tapping his foot and checking his watch. The younger guy was scanning the neighborhood like he was expecting backup to arrive at any moment. After I finished reading, I told them that I appreciated their thoroughness and that I was ready to cooperate fully with their enforcement action. I said I just needed to step outside so they could properly arrest me according to the procedures outlined in their citation. Both of them perked up when I said this. The older guy straightened his vest and unclipped what looked like plastic handcuffs from his belt. The younger guy got on his radio and said something about suspect compliance and proceeding with detainment. I opened my screen door and stepped outside with my hands visible. The older guy immediately moved toward me with the handcuffs while explaining that I was being detained for obstruction of an HOA investigation and failure to provide proper identification. Just as he reached for my wrist, two actual sheriff's deputies pulled into my driveway with their lights flashing. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The fake officers froze like they'd been caught in a spotlight. The first deputy got out of his patrol car and immediately asked what was going on. The older fake officer stepped forward and started explaining that they were conducting an HOA enforcement action and had the situation under control. He tried to talk to the deputy like they were colleagues working the same case. The deputy looked confused and asked to see their law enforcement credentials. When they showed him their plastic ID cards with QR codes, his expression changed completely. He called for his partner and asked both fake officers to step away from me. The second deputy started asking them questions about what agency they worked for and who had authorized them to conduct arrests in his jurisdiction. The younger fake officer started stammering about HOA bylaws and Citizens Arrest Authority. The older one tried to maintain his authority figure act, but was clearly realizing he'd made a serious mistake. When the deputies asked to see the weapons they were carrying, things got interesting. The older guy had a taser and pepper spray on his belt, while the younger one was carrying zip ties and what looked like a collapsible baton. None of these were illegal to own, but using them to intimidate people while impersonating law enforcement was definitely crossing a line. The deputies separated them and started taking statements. I provided my recording of the incident and explained that they had threatened to arrest me for refusing to show identification to people who wouldn't provide proper credentials. I also gave them the fake citation they'd written and pointed out all the ways it was designed to look like an official legal document. While one deputy was questioning the fake officers, the other asked me about the HOA situation and how long this had been going on. I explained about the bird feeder dispute and the increasingly aggressive notices I'd been receiving. I mentioned that the HOA president had been particularly active lately in looking for violations. The deputy asked for the HOA president's name and address, which I provided. He said they'd be paying him a visit to discuss the hiring of private security contractors to intimidate residents. The way he said it made me think the HOA president was about to have a very unpleasant conversation. After about an hour of questioning, the deputies arrested both fake officers. The charges included impersonating law enforcement officers, harassment, and making terroristic threats. The older guy kept insisting that he was just doing his job and that the HOA had given him the authority to conduct investigations. The younger one looked like he was about to cry. As they were being loaded into the patrol cars, I asked one of the deputies what would happen next. He explained that the district attorney's office would review the case and determine what additional charges might be appropriate. He also said they'd be investigating the HOA's involvement in hiring these individuals and whether any homeowner association funds had been used improperly. The next morning, I got a phone call from someone claiming to be the HOA board's emergency legal counsel. She explained that the board had just learned about the unauthorized security contractors and wanted to distance themselves from the actions of their president. She said they were conducting their own investigation and would be in touch soon. I told her that was interesting because I hadn't contacted the HOA about the incident yet. I asked how they'd learned about it so quickly. There was a long pause before she said the sheriff's department had contacted them as part of their investigation. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA board announcing that their president had been removed from his position effective immediately. The letter explained that he had exceeded his authority by hiring private contractors without board approval and using HOA funds for unauthorized activities. They claimed they had no knowledge of his enforcement scheme and were cooperating fully with law enforcement. The letter also mentioned that all pending violation notices were being reviewed by their legal team and that residents who felt they had been improperly targeted could request a hearing with the new board. It was signed by 5 board members and included an apology for any inconvenience or distress caused by the former president's actions. I decided to do some research into the former HOA president's background and discovered some interesting information. According to public records, he'd previously worked as a mall security guard and had been terminated from that position for exceeding his authority. Apparently, intimidating people was a pattern for this guy. I also learned that the 2 fake officers were his nephew and the nephew's friend. Neither had any law enforcement or security experience, but they'd both been unemployed for several months before being hired by the HOA president. The whole operation seemed to be some kind of family business arrangement funded by neighborhood dues. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. The district attorney's office decided to pursue felony charges against all 3 men for conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement officers. The fake officers pled guilty to reduced charges and received probation along with community service. The former HOA president tried to fight the charges, but eventually accepted a plea deal that included restitution payments to affected homeowners. The civil lawsuit was even more interesting. My attorney discovered that the former president had been using HOA funds to purchase the tactical equipment and pay his fake officers for several months. The board claimed they hadn't noticed the unauthorized expenses, but an audit revealed that he'd been falsifying budget reports to cover his tracks. The Homeowner Association's insurance company initially refused to cover the legal costs, claiming that the president's actions weren't covered under their policy. This led to a lengthy dispute that ultimately resulted in the HOA having to pay damages out of their reserve funds. Since the reserves weren't sufficient to cover all the costs, the board had to approve a special assessment on all homeowners. Several neighbors who'd been targeted by the fake officers joined a class action lawsuit against the former president and the HOA. The total damages exceeded $200,000, which was more than the association could afford. The former president was forced to sell his house to cover his portion of the settlement. Meanwhile, the new HOA board was trying to rebuild trust with the community. They hired a proper management company to handle day-to-day operations and implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of authority. They also revised the enforcement policies to ensure that all violations were handled through proper legal channels. About 3 months after the incident, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was much different in tone. It was a formal apology for the harassment I'd experienced and an acknowledgement that my bird feeder had never actually violated any legitimate HOA rules. The letter explained that the former president had been making up violations to justify his enforcement activities. The board also granted me what they called a lifetime variance for my bird feeder and any other reasonable outdoor fixtures that brought me enjoyment. They said they wanted to focus on real community issues like road maintenance and common area upkeep rather than policing personal expression within reasonable limits. The letter concluded with an invitation to join the new Architectural Review Committee if I was interested in helping establish fair and reasonable guidelines for the community. They said my legal background would be valuable in ensuring that future policies were both enforceable and respectful of homeowners' rights. I have to admit, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The former president's attempt to intimidate me into compliance had resulted in him losing his house, facing criminal charges, and ultimately giving me more freedom than I'd had before the whole mess started. Sometimes the best strategy is just to let people dig their own holes deep enough to bury themselves. The fake officers learned an expensive lesson about the difference between playing dress-up and actual authority. The nephew ended up moving back in with his parents after his conviction made it difficult to find employment. His friend took a job at a car wash and seemed to have given up on his law enforcement fantasies. As for the former HOA president, he moved to another state after selling his house. I heard through neighbors that he'd been trying to get involved in his new HOA, but word of his criminal conviction had gotten around. Apparently, having a record for impersonating law enforcement officers doesn't look great on an application to join a community board. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up to bullies, especially ones who think a costume gives them power they don't actually have. In my job, I deal with people who try to avoid being served papers by pretending to be someone else or claiming authority they don't possess. The key is staying calm, knowing your rights, and letting them make the mistakes that will ultimately expose their deception. The new HOA board has been much more reasonable to deal with. They actually follow proper procedures when addressing concerns and treat homeowners like adults rather than children who need to be controlled. It's amazing how much better a community functions when the people in charge aren't drunk on power. I kept the fake citation as a souvenir of the incident. Sometimes when I'm having a bad day at work, I look at it and remember how satisfying it was to watch those fake officers realize they'd picked the wrong person to mess with. The document is so obviously fake that it's almost comical, but it probably would have intimidated someone who didn't know better. The bird feeder is still in my front yard, attracting cardinals and blue jays just like it always has. I've added a small plaque next to it that reads, "Lifetime variance granted," as a little joke for neighbors who know the story. Most people think it's funny, though I suspect a few former supporters of the old president aren't quite as amused. Looking back, I'm glad I handled the situation the way I did. It would have been easy to get angry and start shouting at those fake officers, but that would have given them an excuse to escalate things further. Instead, staying calm and letting them think they were in control allowed them to dig themselves into a hole they couldn't climb out of. The incident also made me appreciate the professionalism of real law enforcement officers. The deputies who responded to my call handled the situation perfectly, asking the right questions and quickly identifying the fake officers for what they were. They took the matter seriously and made sure appropriate charges were filed. I've had a few conversations with neighbors about the incident since then. Most were shocked to learn what had been happening and grateful that someone had finally stood up to the former president's intimidation tactics. A few admitted that they'd received similar visits from the fake officers but had been too scared to report them. One elderly neighbor told me that the fake officers had convinced her to pay a $100 fine for having the wrong color mailbox. She'd been so intimidated by their official-looking equipment and aggressive demeanor that she'd written them a check on the spot. When I told her about the criminal charges, she was furious that she'd been scammed. The story spread quickly through the neighborhood and became something of a legend. People still bring it up at community meetings and neighborhood gatherings. Some folks have started joking about hiring their own fake enforcement officers to deal with real problems like speeding cars and unleashed dogs. The incident also had some unexpected benefits for the community as a whole. The audit that was conducted during the legal proceedings revealed other financial irregularities that had been going on for years. The former president had been approving contracts for his friends and family members without competitive bidding and inflating maintenance costs to pad the HOA's budget. The new board used this information to renegotiate several service contracts and implement better financial oversight procedures. As a result, they were able to reduce homeowners' monthly fees for the first time in years while actually improving services. It turns out that getting rid of corruption is good for everyone except the people doing the corrupting. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't known my rights or if I'd been intimidated into compliance like some of my neighbors were. The fake officers might have continued their operation indefinitely, collecting illegal fines and terrorizing residents who didn't know any better. The former president would have kept expanding his little fiefdom until someone else finally stood up to him. The experience reinforced my belief that knowledge is power, especially when dealing with people who are trying to abuse their authority. Understanding the legal system and knowing how real law enforcement operates gave me the confidence to challenge the fake officers' claims. Without that background, I might have been just as intimidated as my neighbors were. The district attorney's office later told me that my case had helped them identify a pattern of similar schemes in other neighborhoods. Apparently, hiring fake security officers to intimidate residents is becoming more common as HOAs become increasingly aggressive in their enforcement efforts. My case helped establish precedent for how to prosecute these situations. The fake officers themselves seemed genuinely surprised when they were arrested. I think they really believed that wearing official-looking equipment and using the right terminology gave them actual authority. The nephew later admitted during his plea hearing that his uncle had convinced him they were helping to maintain property values and protect the community. The younger fake officer actually sent me an apology letter after he was sentenced. He said he'd been unemployed for months and desperate for work when the former president offered him the job. He claimed he didn't understand that what they were doing was illegal and thought they were just helping enforce community rules. Whether that's true or just part of his attempt to reduce his sentence, I'll never know. The whole situation reminded me that most bullies are actually cowards who rely on intimidation because they don't have real power. Once someone calls their bluff, they usually crumble pretty quickly. The fake officers talked tough when they thought I was going to comply, but they fell apart as soon as real authority showed up. The former president's downfall was particularly satisfying because he'd been making life miserable for so many people in the neighborhood. His obsession with control had turned what should have been a pleasant community into a place where people were afraid to express their individuality. Getting him removed from power freed everyone from his petty tyranny. The new board has been asking for my input on various community issues, which has been interesting. They seem genuinely committed to finding reasonable solutions rather than just imposing arbitrary rules. It's refreshing to deal with people who understand that their job is to serve the community, not control it. I've also been contacted by other homeowners in different neighborhoods who are dealing with similar problems with their HOAs. Word of my case has spread through legal networks, and people are using it as an example of how to fight back against abusive enforcement practices. It's gratifying to know that standing up for my rights has helped other people do the same. The bird feeder that started this whole mess is thriving. I've counted at least 15 different species of birds that visit regularly, and my neighbors often stop by to watch them. Some have asked for advice on setting up their own bird feeders, and the new board has actually started promoting wildlife-friendly landscaping as a community initiative. The irony of the situation still makes me smile. The former president's attempt to eliminate one small bird feeder ended up creating a neighborhood full of them. His efforts to control every aspect of community life resulted in residents gaining more freedom than they'd ever had. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people defeat themselves. Looking back, I'm grateful for the experience despite the stress it caused at the time. It taught me valuable lessons about standing up for my principles and showed me that bullies can be defeated if you're willing to stay calm and let them make mistakes. It also brought the community together in a way that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The fake officers may have thought they were intimidating me with their costumes and equipment, but all they really did was provide me with entertainment and a great story to tell at parties. As I always say, uniforms don't make the man, but they do make for interesting mugshots when worn by the wrong people. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I worked for a very long time at a small company that created some niche products. The company had a lot of scientists and engineers around to develop and refine the products this company made. Over the years, the people in the science and engineering departments changed, but I still stuck around. They paid well, and I got a lot of time off. I also only had to work 40 hours per week, which was nice. My job in software was to support the production of equipment. I wrote custom software that calibrated and configured the devices. At the click of a button, someone could run the software with minimal human interaction needed. When I started, I was the only developer. By the time I left, there were 4 developers. That should give you an idea about the size of the company. Not large, but profitable. At the beginning of my time at the company, each piece of software was originally developed by a scientist or engineer. Each and every one had their own pet language they preferred to use. They would start the software, and when they felt that it was ready for prime time, they would hand it off to me. I would then make it actually ready for use. This included things like error handling and streamlining the user experience. Also, finding the massive amount of bugs that were in the code. This also meant that originally the company used dozens of different programming languages. Towards the end of my time with the company, they had decided they were going to mostly focus on Windows computers. So we used primarily C derivatives, C, C++, C#, and web technology, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, PHP. There were other languages floating around, but this is what we mostly used. All 4 of us were proficient in these languages, and I was the only one that could handle the edge cases of old programs from before this consolidation. By the time of this story, we had been using these languages for nearly a decade. For most of my time at the company, we had worked under the engineering department for a person that wasn't really a software manager. So we were left to run ourselves. One day, the company decided they needed to hire an actual software manager. So they found one that came with excellent credentials. He had a lot of experience managing software teams. He actually came in and didn't change things right away, for which I was grateful and held out hope that it would all work out. Then came the fateful day. One day he pulled us all into a conference room and told us that company would be making a shift. One of the scientists was complaining that they couldn't understand the software we were writing and needed to be able to edit it. So instead of teaching the scientists C and such, we were going to shift 100% of all new code to Python, starting immediately. Any new code written needed to be in Python. I brought up the fact that none of us knew Python. I was told that we could take classes in our own time on our own dime if we wanted. I pointed out that learning a new language would slow down our delivery of software. Python isn't hard, so I had no doubt we could get there. But we had libraries written of common code that we just plugged in when needed. None of those could be used. In fact, we had to figure out how to plug Python into existing programs that needed updates. Any updates had to be done in Python. And, not only that, all our code had to be Pythonic, meaning that it had to be done in the proper way for Python, and not utilizing techniques that would technically work in Python but weren't necessarily the correct way in Python. Any code we did write had to be submitted to the complaining scientist to verify that it was Pythonic, which most of it wasn't. So we did exactly as we were told. All of us stopped writing in any language except Python. Everyone stopped working and started writing very simple programs to figure out how Python worked. I was working on a plugin for an existing program to try and resolve some UI issues. However, I really struggled with this because the UI was written in C# and the new code had to be in Python. When I brought this up, I was rebuffed and told it must be done in Python. So I was trying to figure out how to change an existing C# U/I by using new Python code. Our productivity dropped to 0. Not a single bit of software made it to production for the few months this manager was around. After a few months of nothing at all getting done, he decided to leave the company to pursue other opportunities. We weren't told that they fired him, but I'm sure that's what happened. After he left, they brought in a new manager that saw the issue right away and shifted us back to working in C and web languages to support existing software and took a much more sensible approach to software. We were to support existing software in the language in which it was written. Any new software, we would discuss the choice of language. If it was small, then we would use Python. If it was large, then we would use what made sense until we were proficient in Python. And new hires would be trained in Python. We could also take classes during work hours and the company would pay for it. Also, the new manager pushed back on having anyone in the science or engineering departments be able to work on the software that our team supported. They would have input and have to sign off that the science was correct, but no editing ability. Productivity returned to normal. Several new small programs were released written in Python. All the existing software ended up having Python ripped back out of it. All was right with the world again. The next one is an entitled people story. I've mentioned this before in another post, but I really need outside perspective. My sister is 7 years older than me. She's 38. For as long as I can remember, she's behaved badly and caused problems. Our grandparents and our mother have constantly rescued her from consequences. Over the last 2 years, she's been depressed and staying at home, not working. I try to be understanding, but honestly, I don't fully believe it anymore because this pattern has existed her entire life. When our father passed away, I handled everything related to the inheritance by myself while working full-time. The house had debts, lawyers were involved, banks had to be contacted, all of it fell on me. She did nothing. If I hadn't stepped in, she would have been in serious financial trouble too. I basically saved her in this inheritance situation, just like everyone has always done. She only ever contacts me when she wants to hang out or needs something. Recently, she apologized and said she's there for me now, that I can give her tasks and that she wants to grow and get out of her depressive behavior. So I decided to give her a very simple task. About a month ago, we finally sold the house so we can pay off my father's debts and finally live in peace. Now we just need to make some bank appointments. I've already handled several of them, but I thought, okay, maybe this will help her feel useful. On Friday morning, I asked her to call one bank, just one phone call. I even explained that I had already done a lot that day and that my girlfriend had asked me to stay off my phone because we had planned to spend time together, and that this was very important. She replied that she'd do it by Monday at the latest. I said on the same day, please do it as fast as you can. No response after that. On Monday, I reminded her, no response. On Tuesday, my lawyer messaged me about something related to the payout for both of us. Suddenly, she replied within 30 minutes, because that topic directly affects her money. When I told her she needs to communicate certain things directly to the lawyer if she wants them handled that way, I also told her this particular issue wasn't that important to me. Then I asked again, did you call the bank? No response. Of course, I had already called the bank myself on Monday. It took 15 minutes to make an appointment. I knew deep down that asking her to do something would create more work than just doing it myself. And once again, I was right. Whenever situations like this come up, there's always an excuse. She's sick. This seems to happen every couple of weeks. Her phone isn't working. It's supposedly been acting up for years, but only when someone expects something from her. What hurts the most is not the bank call itself. It's that only 3 weeks ago she explicitly told me she wants to change this exact behavior, avoiding responsibility, not communicating, disappearing when something is expected of her. And then the same thing happens again. She also showed me once more that she can respond immediately when money is involved, but not when she's asked to contribute, follow through, or simply communicate. So my question isn't whether she's sick or depressed. My question is, how do I mirror this back to her in a clear adult way? That her actions once again contradict what she said she wants to change, without getting dragged into excuses or being accused of not understanding her illness. Anyway, thank you for watching.